see everybody. As you know, I am an amateur telescope maker, and I'm a visual astronomer. It's all about great observing to me. Oh, I'll take it from the top. I'm an amateur telescope maker. I've been interested in astronomy for a very long time, since back in the days of the space race. And I'm a visual observer. For me, a beautiful aesthetic view of the eyepiece is what it's all about for me. This is my backyard. Not exactly the best place for astronomy, but I like downtown living. And the really sad thing is that the seeing is often about as bad as the light pollution. But downtown living does have some advantages even for amateur astronomers. I got a roof that's well high up in the air, and I give a lot of people, a lot of them are students who come and go through the area, their very first look through a telescope. So it's got some advantages as well. I really enjoy dark sky observing as well. Here we are at the Carr Astronomical Observatory, where you can see aurora and all kinds of cool stuff. Great place for observing as well. That's a 6-inch f8 telescope that I'll get onto later. I was a suburban kid with big floppy Dumbo ears, razor sharp eyes, and an 8 o'clock bedtime. So on those rare occasions when I saw the night sky at all, it was uninspiring. But the space race was on, and like every other kid, I dreamed of climbing aboard a great big rocket ship and blasting off into outer space. Just a while after Ed White made his historic spacewalk, my family and I went to a farm where I made some new friends and I saw the Milky Way for the first time. Wow. That was it. I was done. I was hooked for life. For the first time, I saw colors in stars. Red and orange and yellow and blue, and there were clouds of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon like a million diamonds scattered across black velvet. I perceived space in its true 3 dimensions, and I realized then and there what Carl Sagan used to say, that we're all traveling through space, right home here on Spaceship Earth. Well, fast forward about 35 years or so, this is the first telescope I built. I bought 2 telescopes prior to this. One of them was when I was about 10 years old with a paper route. The very first thing that I bought with the money I earned was a telescope, 3-inch refractor. It was on a rickety mount and showed lots of false color, but didn't matter. I loved it. And I took it out just about every clear night. I much later got a 10-inch Dobsonian that didn't quite cut it for me for observing planets, which was mostly what I liked to do for my backyard in Scarborough at the time. So I built this telescope from an RF Royce design. It's got RF Royce optics down here and protostar secondary. What wonderful scope, except for one thing. It was so big that I could break it in half here and put it in the trunk of the car, but it completely filled the trunk of my car, so it didn't leave a lot of room for camping equipment, so it didn't get out to dark sky as often as I might like. So I sold it, and with the proceeds, I bought a 12.5-inch telescope. That's not it. That's the next telescope that I built. This is a 6-inch f8. I wanted something with more portability than the 12.5. And I was fascinated with the concept of this long tube 6-inch f8, which had been the standard, de facto standard instrument for amateur astronomers for decades. And I was curious to see why. I'd also never owned a equatorial mount, so I thought I'd give it a try. The problem with it was portability. That mount was pretty heavy. It took time to set up. It was more trips to the car along with the battery pack and so on. So eventually I sold it and I built this, a simple Dobsonian mount. This is my most used telescope now. Wonderful instrument. The optical tube is the same, and it loads in the car in one trip. So I just love it. This is the 12.5-inch telescope that I bought from somebody who was poorly made originally. This one is completely rebuilt. The only thing that is original on this scope was the primary mirror, the secondary mirror, and the focuser. Everything else is new. Built that one at the Carr Astronomical Observatory. Optics by Norman Fulham. It is my cure for aperture fever. First light was at the Winter Star Party in Florida. Clouds prevented me from using it or even trying it at home. I met a lot of amateur astronomers and professional astronomers. This instrument, a long-tubed, I think it was a 10-inch f8 as I recall. It was made by a NASA engineer, which is, of course, Cape Canaveral is just up the road. I actually met Al Nagler down there and shook his hand. We had a nice chat. The skies are pretty nice, too. The skies were quite steady. And, of course, Florida's a lot further south than Toronto, so I could see a lot further south. I could see all kinds of southern eye candy that you just cannot see from southern Ontario. To go further south than that, well, I've got this little TV60 apochromatic refractor. It's handy. It's a beautiful scope, punches above its weight, and you can take it just about anywhere. Charlene can tell you it's a wonderful little scope. But it's still only 60 millimeters. I craved something bigger that I could take on board an airplane. So I really had to consider, what did I really, really want? When you build a telescope, it's a pretty big commitment, especially if you build something that's complicated, if you design it from scratch. So I used a chapter from Albert Heig's book to really ask myself some questions that he published in this book, a whole lot of questions you might never dream of. You might recall that that first telescope that I built, that 10-inch f6, was pretty big, and it took up so much room in the trunk of the car that it didn't get out to the dark sky very often. I didn't want something like that to happen to me again, so I looked at a lot of these questions and asked myself a lot of serious questions. Mused on it for a long time. Now, you build a telescope around optics, and from my way of thinking, the most important optic of all is right here. It's your eye, as a visual astronomer. Of course, if you're an imager, you want to consider your camera chip. You want to build around that. There's a great article in the RASC Observer's Handbook, Telescope Exit Pupils, and it has a bit of a discussion about RFT, Richest Field Telescope. That's where you can get the brightest possible image at the eyepiece for visual observing. There's a lot of discussion about other sizes of exit pupil, but that's really what I wanted for this scope. I measured the entrance pupil of my eye with a bunch of drill bits of different sizes, and I found by this method, holding the drill bits in front of my eye, passing them in front of my eye as I looked at a bright star. If that bright star dimmed but did not disappear, I knew that that drill bit was smaller than the entrance pupil of my dark adapted eye. If it blacked out completely, then I knew the drill bit was larger than my dark adapted eye. By this method, I found that the entrance pupil to my eye was between 6 and 7 millimeters. The other critical measure was my favorite wide field eyepiece at 31 Nagler. the holy hand grenade, the Naglinator. Thank you, Monty Python. And I plugged those numbers. There is the 31 millimeters for the eyepiece and the 6 millimeter entrance pupil of my eye, and the 31 millimeters and the 7 millimeter entrance pupil to my eye, and came up with these numbers for an optimal focal ratio for the mirror that I would get to build this telescope, between f3.9 and f4.5. Now, a little bit about telescope focal ratios. This would mean it would be a fast telescope. I was looking at maybe a 6-inch or 8-inch mirror, and that would be about 32 inches in focal length to the point where that mirror comes into focus. A long focal ratio telescope, twice as long. 8 times 8 is 32, or 8 times 4 is 32, 8 times 8 is 64, twice as long. An example of this short focal ratio one is the one I built right over here. There we go. And an example of the longer focal ratio scope, hey, that's Frank's 8-inch f10. They're both 8-inch telescopes. One of them's a lot longer than the other. By the way, if you have a chance to have a look through Frank's scope at Millennium Square, have a look. There's a reason that there's such a big lineup to get to look through the eyepiece. So I considered different optics. I went with GSO 200 millimeter f4. With that favored wide field eyepiece, that would give me 30 power with a bright RFT 6.7 millimeter entrance pupil and a 2.7 degree field of view. Just how big is that? Well, that's almost as wide as the belt stars in Orion. That's about half a binocular field. That's about the measure of, well, between your pinky and your thumb, about that distance apart. Hold your hand at arm's length, Terence Dickinson style, and is big enough to see a whole lot of nice eye candy. Next step, after I had the optics, was to design the telescope with the help of some online tools that are freely available. I did it the old-fashioned way. Yep, I didn't even have CorelDRAW anymore on my computer, so I used pencil, paper, protractor, compass, the old-fashioned way. It did the trick. At some point, I think I'll get CorelDRAW again, or maybe even learn AutoCAD. Well, what did Thomas Edison say? Something like, to be an inventor, you need a good imagination and a whole lot of junk. Well, that really sounds a whole lot like amateur telescope makers. This is what I bought this garage sale kit for. I wanted one drum shell. Here it is again. That's going to become part of the telescope. Yep, right up here, right up there. That's the upper optical assembly. And here it is. Just used an ordinary coping saw. This is up at the car, actually, where I used that coping saw to cut a hole in the drum shell. It was reinforced with half-inch Baltic birch plywood. I'm going to pass this around. It's going to show you some finishes, both the interior and exterior, and a little bit of flocking on it. There we go. And Baltic birch was used in this project extensively. This is the altitude bearing being drilled to save some weight. This is the cog box, is what I call it. It goes right here in the center of the telescope. It holds everything together. The mirror cell goes in the lower optical assembly down here. Keeps everything all lined up. It's a 6-point cell, which a lot of people would consider overkill for an 8-inch mirror, but I figured, hey, why not? If the 3-point mirror cell is just barely adequate, I thought I'd go for overkill just to be sure I'd have the best possible view at the eyepiece. Baltic birch can even be drilled and tapped like a bolt, which is what I made here, kind of a wooden bolt. I used crazy glue to harden the hole, let it dry thoroughly, then tapped it again, and indeed, it acted much like a bolt. I'll show you where I used that later. Here's the lower optical assembly coming together down here. The mirror cell and the mirror will fit in here. I used epoxy glue to assemble everything. That's a very strong glue, which I also used to coat all of these finished pieces. This is after 6 days of work. I coated all the wood with epoxy to waterproof it, then sanded it down in preparation for painting. You got a sample out here somewhere. That's what I did for the exterior. This is before painting and after. This is what I used for the paint on the exterior, Rust-Oleum hammered black. And I used a bare marquee for the interior surfaces by using a paintbrush and just tapping it over the surface of the wood. That gave a kind of a dappled, rough finish, which made it seem a little bit blacker than it was with the Krylon Ultra Flat Black, which was the first coat on the interior of the telescope. Next, onto the aluminum. You can cut aluminum with hand tools, carpentry tools. I tested parts as I went along. Here's the rocker bars, which will be part of the mirror cell, taking shape. Tested the clamps in the cog box. That'll go right over here once again. And the spider is after design by R.F. Royce. It's a curved spider to minimize diffraction from the spider vanes. On other telescopes, I've got 4-vane, straight vane spiders and a 3-vane spider, which I use in the 6-inch. Around bright stars and planets, you can see those diffraction spikes. For this one, they're a lot less visible, barely noticeable, even though it's quite a thick piece of metal. This hobby brass is available from Michaels and Sayal Electronics. Now, earlier I mentioned that I drilled and tapped a piece of Baltic birch plywood. Here's what I did. That's actually drilled and tapped. Here's the bolt that fits into it. And there's that large secondary mirror, which is necessary for such a fast telescope with such a fast focal ratio. And the curved spider you can see up here as well in the optical assembly. I calculated the truss tube lengths did all the trigonometry with an online tool, and used a pipe cutter to cut the truss tubes to an accuracy within 1 millimeter. I used a jig to drill all of the tubes to the same length, and I also used a jig to drill all of the aluminum parts so that I could have a consistent size from one part to the other so that the telescope could assemble quite easily. Before I painted them, I did a test assembly of the parts to ensure that the telescope could reach focus with all of my eyepieces. It didn't. It could focus with some of my eyepieces, but not others. I shortened the focal length of the telescope by about 3/4 of an inch, or about 2 centimeters, and then all of my eyepieces could reach focus. Around the edge of the primary mirror, I put a piece of formica. I glued it in place. That was to support the mirror at its center of gravity. Here's why. This is the lateral bearing to prevent a lateral shift of the mirror, sideways shift. So that will hold the mirror in place sideways. And down below, it's a 6-point mirror cell. Here you can see 4 of those points, which ride on the rocker bars, which evenly distribute the weight of the mirror. From below, there are 3 collimation knobs, which adjust the mirror cell, which you can see parts of it through a hole where later I will install a fan. From above, here is all 6 points of the cell, and you might just be able to see these 2 black Teflon things at the mirror's edge that I showed you earlier will rest against. And there's the mirror in position. You might just be able to see a little bit of those lateral supports. And finally, after about a 9-month gestation period for this telescope, came Not first flight, but first light, at last. How'd it do? Pretty good. At RFT, I could find objects in that nice wide field of view pretty easily, even without a finder. There's the Swan Nebula through an O3 filter, and the Lagoon Nebula. And in between these two objects, I saw all kinds of nebulosity using an O3 filter that I had never seen before. So I was pretty happy about that. I think that's because I had an RFT view. Also had a look at the Andromeda Galaxy. All of the part that you can see visually fit within that 2.7 degree field. Imagers can extend that out to about 3 degrees. So that would extend beyond what I could see visually with this scope, but it was a very aesthetic appearance. Just looked dusty, bright, and beautiful. At higher magnification, say 92 power and above, I found that diffraction started to become an issue, and the image started to break down. That's the fault of this large secondary mirror. How big? Well, it is about that big. If this is the primary mirror at 200 millimeters, this is 70 millimeters, or about 35%. So it's quite large. Ordinarily, with a longer focal ratio Newtonian, such as, say, a 8-inch f6, you might find about a 20% secondary, which causes a lot less diffraction, making it suitable for higher magnifications. According to Texero, if a long focal ratio Newtonian with a secondary mirror of just 13% can have truly refractor-like views. So that's an advantage of the long focal ratio telescope. So that's how it did visually. Let's see if I could actually carry this on an airplane. I disassembled it bit by bit and fit it in a suitcase. Yes, it fits. But would it fit within airline baggage restrictions? Yes, it did. Still left me a little bit of room for socks and underwear. So reassembling the telescope, I wouldn't want to try this in the dark because there's a lot of loose parts. I used tools to assemble it. I didn't think the wing nuts, which I did purchase, would really grip as tight as I'd really want. I wanted to really be firmly put together. This is the lower optical assembly down here, down at the bottom. The lower trusses, which are down below, and connect that to the cog box, which is the center. The upper tubes up here, the truss tubes, and finally the upper optical assembly at the top of the telescope. The rocker box was next. It fit together kind of like IKEA furniture, and finally assembled in 36 minutes. This was the second time that I assembled it from that little pile of junk that was in the suitcase. I've taken it out to Long Sault. That is a dark sky observing spot, about an hour and a half from home. This is an 8-inch f6 with a longer tube nearby. That's somebody else's scope. And the 8-inch f4 is pretty short and stubby by comparison. So after 180 hours of work and $600 to build it, so not a lot of money, but a whole lot of hours. Was it worth it? For me, yes. It did what I wanted it to do. The question that many of you might be asking is, should I build my own telescope? Well, yeah, maybe. It's not for everybody, but maybe it is for you. The big question out of all of these and many more is, hey, ain't it the truth? Hey, Newton was, he was the warden of the Royal Mint. He ought to know. You might love building a telescope. I do, because that's the main thing for me, is that I enjoy doing it. I enjoy building things, I enjoy designing things, but in the end, it's all about a great view at the eyepiece, a really beautiful aesthetic view that reminded me of what I saw when I looked at that night sky for that gorgeous Milky Way when I was a 5-year-old kid. By the way, Time is Money was actually written by Benjamin Franklin, not Newton. They say that we stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, I'm no Ben Franklin, I'm certainly no Newton. Newman. I'm more like a Newman. Yeah, I had a lot of fun building it. And again, we're back in my backyard here. If it wasn't for people like Newton, who invented the Newtonian telescope, and say John Dobson, pictured earlier by Chris, who designed a simple telescope that once you have the optics together, you could maybe put it together in a weekend if you're handy, and many others, Krieg and Battery, and many other amateurs and professionals who came up with many different techniques and tools that can help you build a telescope. And with things like the resources we have now, books, there's the library, there's the internet, we've got fantastic resources now. And if all of these people didn't share with me, there's no way I could have built this telescope. And in gratitude to them and for the CAR, who allowed me to use the CAR Astronomical Observatory in part to build this telescope, I'm grateful. I'm really grateful. And for this reason, I'm delighted to share with you my experience and a little bit of what knowledge I've learned from this project. For those of you who are interested in maybe making your own telescope, I put together a list of some resources I found particularly helpful. You don't need to copy it all down. I'll put it on a link to my Facebook page and maybe somewhere else on the net. This is from the RASC Toronto's YouTube channel. So that's about it, everybody. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
How did you shorten your focal length?
Oh, what I did was I cut the tubes. I used the Clevis Books has published online a right-angled triangle calculator, and I found out. Well, I just guessed. Well, another 3/4 of an inch or so should do it. If I shortened the focal length by that much, I calculated all of the truss lengths all over again from scratch. Moved the jig, made it a little better, or just the right length, and that time it worked without a hitch, no problem.
Fascinating project. How far out of collimation does it get? Do you have to do a major collimation every time you use it, or does it more or less keep collimation?
It does a pretty good job of holding collimation, actually. I suppose that I overbuilt it. At this focal ratio, I'm fussy about collimation. So I find I can leave it fully assembled almost all the time. I just rebuilt. I had it assembled actually way back in July. And then the next time that I disassembled it and reassembled it was just this week. So in the meantime, it's been fully assembled that whole time. So in that whole time, I've just done minor tweaks to collimation. During the course of a night, I do not need to recollimate, even though it's a fast F4. It's a pretty beefy structure, short and stubby and really wide. It's built kind of like a troll. Shorty. So I'm happy with how it collimates and how it holds collimation. Yes?
Question online. Yeah, question online is, how much does it weigh?
That weighs, as I recall, 32 pounds. So I can pick it up and lift it. In fact, let's do that right now, shall we? That's a little bit more with the counterweights. There we go. Yeah, not bad.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. With the mirror removed, I have not yet put in a couple of things. I got a few tweaks to do yet, but that's with all the toys here. It'll weigh a bit more, but I'm really pleased with it all in all. Any other questions? Oh yes.
Yeah, the illustration of Andromeda before, was that a sketch or was
Oh, that wasn't a sketch. No, that was a NASA picture.
was that a picture like you just go in and you see it right on the spot like that, or?
That was pretty close to the naked, or at the naked eye view. That was
Very
pretty close to the
detailed.
telescopic view.
Right.
Yeah, I just got an image off the net that NASA produced. That was in full color. I just took out the color, and that was pretty close. In this image, it would extend a bit more than what I actually saw at the eyepiece. But you cannot see all of the Andromeda Galaxy visually. You need to image it in order to get it out to that full 3 degrees. So it fit well within a 2.7 degree field of view. But it was a beautiful view. One of my favorite appearances of the galaxy. It's beautiful in any scope. Yes?
Silly question here. When you pack it up in your suitcase, do you take the mirror out? Do you pack that separately?
I probably will. I think I'll pack it in styrofoam and put it in the suitcase, just so the edges don't get chipped. One little job that I've got to do is put in some nylon bolts to hold it in place so that I can leave the mirror in at least when I'm going, got it in the trunk of my car. Yes, Ed?
Here?
Yep.
Yes. I find it interesting that you designed it around the eyepiece,
Uh-huh.
it sounds like. What happens if you find a new favorite eyepiece?
I guess I'll just have to make another telescope.
I'm always astonished.
Turn it on, please.
I'm always astonished in the way you guys build telescopes. It's one thing to see a telescope in a magazine or online. It's another thing to actually see the actual fruits of your labor. So the design is amazing. I walked in, I thought that was something that you bought, not realizing it was something that you made. So great job.
Thank you very much.
The tools they use, were they use your own tools, or did you have to go out and get the tools you needed in order to build this?
The only tool that I don't have that I really need was a table saw, which they've got at the car. And there's also various workshops around Toronto that have a table saw. All the other tools I've got. I used to be a homeowner a million years ago, and I was pretty handy.
Another question online, is there an official group of amateur telescope makers?
Official group, I think that a lot of astronomy clubs do have collectives of people who build telescopes. Also, I'm a member of Facebook. There are at least 2 amateur telescope making groups there. One of them is Telescope Making South Africa, and there's another one as well, its name I can't recall right now. But there are amateur telescope making groups and forums and things. Online is a great resource. Right here in Southern Ontario, there are some very advanced amateur telescope makers, much more advanced than me.
None in for the city of Toronto or GTA area?
That would be a good question for Allard. I believe that there is. He could fill you in on the details.
Great. More questions? No, we're good? Okay.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.